Ah, welcome. Where are we this week? Journeying back to the ancient days of the 1960s. The decade of the space race, in which Russia and America jostled for position amongst the indifferent stars, just as though they were both trying to get served at the bar ahead of Justin Lee Collins. But yes, an epic race between the two greatest superpowers ever to exist. The race to take the first steps onto another world. For the victors, worldwide acclaim and the knowledge that they and they alone have conquered the moon. For the losers, tears, ignominy, a sense of worthlessness and despair. The realization that everything, decades of thankless toil, of inhuman struggle and travail has come to nothing, with only the barren husk of a wasted existence remaining. What would that be like? Please welcome Helen Keane with It Is Rocket Science.
Thank you. In this series, we'll be taking a low-budget, highly subjective look at the history and future of space travel. And providing me with excellent assistance, it's not a man, it's a machine. It can't be bargained with, it can't be reasoned with, and it certainly can't be made compatible with Microsoft Excel. I built him myself. Please welcome the voice of space.
Hello.
Competition is all around us. In today's world, after hard afternoons Googling people you went to school with to check how much better than you they're doing these days, you have only to switch on your television late at night and then behold the struggle for the great prize.
That was Andy from Deptford, who's won himself £15. Can you do any better? Probably. I'm not judging, but I think Andy may have had a drink. To recap, I'm looking for things you might see in the night sky. So far, we've had approaching death and trainers. Please call in. Please. I'm all alone here. Back after this break.
Hey, it's 3 a.m. Why don't you pick up the phone to talk to girls in your area, in bikinis, in a jacuzzi, in debt to catalogues and possibly drug dealers, waiting to talk to you entirely of their own free will.
But let us go back to the 1960s. Days of a truly global competition when the stakes were winning a new world. And the girl in your area was the first woman in space, 26-year-old Valentina Vladimirovna Tereshkova, soaring 140 miles up over your head as she orbited the Earth 48 times in Vostok 6.
She was up there for 2 days, 22 hours and 50 minutes, longer than all the male American astronauts at that point put together. And not, as someone suggested to me the other day, because she was only a woman and they forgot about her. But back to the chronology. We haven't even had a man up there yet. So, America and Russia want to prove which is the better system, capitalism or communism, and they will clash in the arena of the stars.
See also Cuba.
So the two greatest superpowers on Earth were locked in a vital struggle. Who would be the first to put a man on the moon?
Nuke the other one. Tonight, we are going to attempt to recapture the knife-edge excitement of the Cold War using our studio audience to plot an audio respondograph of the conflicts and competition between the two superpowers.
And 1969 was like well ages ago, so the tension will be real, as probably no one here today remembers who won. Half the audience will be 1960s America, and half will be 1960s Soviet Russia.
The Americans commenced the space race, bizarrely in the rear. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launches the first artificial satellite. Today, a new moon is in the sky. Placed in orbit by a Russian rocket, the Sputnik satellite circles the globe. Listen now for the sound that will forever separate the old from the new.
The Russians are jubilant. The Americans are astounded and aghast.
There's many a slip twixt cup and lip, and the space race was an unusually slippery cup indeed. A cup made of buttered black ice that had been dipped in an oil spill and wrapped in a banana skin. The Russian space program didn't have a great deal of money behind it, or particularly good facilities compared to the United States.
But what it did have was one very determined, very talented man who had experienced the hate of the Stalinist purges, but who built his Sputnik with love, polishing it with his hanky till it shone like the new and full moon it was.
My name is Sergei Korolev. I am an engineering genius. It is I who sent the first satellite into orbit. It is I who will send the first animal, the first man and the first woman into orbit, land the first unmanned probe on the moon, and will be behind the first spacewalk. I make Jay-Z look like a lazy underachiever, and Stephen Hawking look like a div. But at the grand celebrations of my achievements, people brush past me, oblivious. The Soviets public figure the West will try to kill me, so nobody knows my name.
Now, I know what this is like because as an up-and-coming comedy writer/performer, I've spent most of my adult life temping. Every office angel's job, no one ever knows my bloody name. So tell me about it, Sergei.
It is not the same.
Korolev's work struck fear into American hearts. If Russia could shoot a satellite into space, it could easily use the same rockets to fire its atomic weapons at America. The space race and the arms race were growing up side by side, like good and evil twins in the sort of trashy novel that Helen Keane would pretend she hadn't read. But cometh the hour, cometh the man. And the US President John F. Kennedy realizes space is a way to ignite optimism in the American people.
He gives a series of speeches which I would urge you to look up after the show, because if, like me, you don't remember JFK and you only know about him from, say, those Channel 4 documentaries, it's easy to dismiss him as just an opportunistic mobster slag.
His witty, inspiring, intelligent speeches galvanize the Yanks against the pinky leftos and get them back in the race.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Unfortunately, we don't have a balancing speech at this point from Khrushchev, but I can tell you something he said. Years after Kennedy was shot, Khrushchev was asked in an interview how he thought the world would have been a different place if he'd been assassinated rather than President Kennedy. Khrushchev thought about it for a moment and then he said, I don't think Aristotle Onassis would have married Mrs. Khrushchev.
After Sputnik came Mutnik, the dog Laika, the first living, at least for a while, creature to orbit the Earth. Her journey heralded a golden age of animal space travel. In August 1960, Belka and Strelka were the first dogs to be sent into orbit and returned safely. They were accompanied by a grey rabbit, 42 mice, and 2 rats, as if someone at the Kremlin had said,
Comrades, what could be a greater symbol of the power of our collective spirit than a ballistic missile carrying an onboard branch of pets at home?
The survival of those earliest animal astronauts proved that a living being could be sent into orbit and safely returned. On April 12th, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin is the first man to orbit the Earth. His space-helmeted image becomes iconic the world over, unlike Korolev's.
You see, my masterpiece, human spaceflight. And still, I am not on the stamps. Yuri is on the stamps. The bloody dogs are on all the stamps. Not me.
America begins to catch up, but the space race subjects its competitors to inhuman pressures.
and not just the pressures caused by acceleration of 7 times 9.81 meters per second.
While risking their lives, astronauts and cosmonauts had to be faultless role models and ambassadors at all times. E.g., American astronaut and epic effer and jeffer Eugene Cernan had to give a public apology for entirely reasonably swearing in reaction to a terrifying systems failure on board Apollo 10. Also, under pressure and overworked, in 1966, at the peak of his success, Sergei Korolev went into hospital for routine surgery, apparently on his hemorrhoids.
Oh, do you have to tell everyone?
Tragically, he died under anaesthetic.
Oh.
All those years trying to find a way to the moon when really he should have been trying to get more fibre into his diet. The Soviet space program never really recovers from his loss.
Though on the upside, I am on like all the stamps after that.
And when international space hero Yuri Gagarin died a couple of years later in a fighter jet crash, the one photo found in his wallet was not of his family, his mother, his wife or his child, but of Korolev. Yeah, I thought so. But to recap.
In 1957, the first satellite is launched by a Russian R-7 rocket, which is the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. And only a month later, the first dog dies quite quickly in orbit, taking the Soviets way ahead of the Americans. But in January 61, the Americans begin to creep up on the Soviets by sending a chimp controlled by electric shocks into space. But then in 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man to orbit the Earth. Less than a month later, Al Shepard becomes the first American in space, and for a while it seems like things are neck and neck. In 1963, we see the first woman in space, a Soviet victory. But then the death of Korolev sets them back. The US surges, and in 1969, Neil Armstrong becomes the first man on the moon. America wins! Sorry, comes in peace for all mankind. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the surface of the moon, the whole planet celebrates. Every government sends telegrams of congratulation. 1/5 of the world's population watches. But human beings are fickle, and the world's interest quickly wanes. Only to pick up at the prospect of disaster on Apollo 13.
Ooh.
But by the final voyage, the moon had become commonplace.
Meh. It was only as an adult that I understood the full tragedy of the space race. The race that had taken us to the moon, but no further.
A tragedy of wasted potential. Early achievements squandered. Opportunities neglected. Hopes betrayed. And astronauts prosecuted for stalking and the misappropriation of adult nappies.
The parallels with my own life were unavoidable. What has happened to the lofty 60s dreams of life in space? Only the resurgence of the old Soviet space program in the new Russia inspired me. And as I watched the exultant, weightless face of Dennis Tito and the other pay-as-you-go astronauts on the news, I felt optimistic. The space program could be renewed. I felt inspired. Maybe it is all still possible.
Perhaps, Helen, one day you too might be saved by a string of rich businessmen who'd be willing to pay money to go up in you. Only 3 years after the epoch-defining journey of Apollo 11, the moon missions were wound down. Apollo 17 was the last time humans set foot on the moon.
So how did they feel, the Apollo 17 astronauts? Those men who'd won one of the fiercest competitions ever, against the Russians and against their own comrades to be selected for the US space program. Aware that the world's interest was moving on, the moment had almost passed. What did they do, these final day trippers on the costliest char-a-bang jaunt ever?
They sang and they skipped, light-hearted and light everything else. And they enjoyed their very last day for all it was worth, because it's always later than you think.
I was strolling on the moon one day, in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May. Hippity-hoppity, hippity-hopping over hill.
Actual footage. We'll leave you now with what were apparently the last words ever spoken on the moon by sweary Eugene Cernan, brave commander of the Apollo 17 mission. Officially, these were...
We leave as we came, and, God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. God bless the crew of Apollo 17.
But unofficially, after that, he said...
Okay, let's get this mother out of here.
It Is Rocket Science starred Helen Keane, Peter Serafinowicz, and Susie Kane. It was written by Miriam Underhill and Helen Keane. The producer was Gareth Edwards.